My name is Monica Myers, and I was 16 the year my mother died twice. Once in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and cut lies, and once 2 weeks later when my father walked a stranger through her front door and told me to be polite. The house behind that door had belonged to my mother's family for 3 generations. Everybody in Monroe County called it the Hale Place. Yesterday I drove past it and found a red for sale sign staked into my grandmother's flower bed. The woman selling it was that same stranger from the doorway, 16 years older and finally certain the land was hers. She was wrong about that. What the county records had quietly remembered all these years, and what I found folded inside one of my father's old coats, is the part nobody in that courthouse saw coming. Welcome back to Revenge Drama Stories 1, where we tell quiet stories about ordinary women, the families that underestimate them, and the slow, certain way the truth comes out. If a house ever held the last of someone you loved, you already know why I couldn't look away. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The cancer took my mother, Carol, in the spring I turned 16. She was 48. She died in the front bedroom of the Hale farmhouse, in the bed her own mother had died in because she had asked to come home from the hospital for the end. I held her hand. My father, Raymond, stood by the window and looked at the fields. People came to the funeral with casseroles and the kind of hugs that last too long. They told me my mother was at peace. I believed them because I was 16 and grief had not yet taught me to count the days. Then I started counting. 2 weeks, 14 days after we lowered her into the Hale family plot, my father's truck pulled into the gravel drive and a woman climbed out of the passenger seat. Her name was Sharon. She wore a yellow blouse and carried a small suitcase like she already knew which room would be hers. I stood on the porch in my mother's old cardigan and could not make my mouth work. My father did not look ashamed. He looked relieved, the way a man looks when he has finally set down something heavy. At supper that night, with my mother's chair still pushed in at the head of the table, he laid his fork down and said the thing I would hear in my sleep for years. It's time we all moved on. I was 16. I did not yet know that some sentences are doors, and that the people who say them are deciding right then who gets to stay inside. Sharon did not waste time. By the end of the first month, my mother's quilts were boxed in the attic, and new curtains hung in the kitchen, beige ones, the color of giving up. The good china that had come down through the Hale women went into a cupboard nobody opened. Sharon rearranged the living room so the couch faced the television instead of the window where my mother used to sit with her coffee and watch the light come up over the back 40. I learned not to comment. When I moved a photograph back to its old spot, it was gone by morning. Sharon was never loud about it. She had a softer method. She would smile at me across a room full of my father's relatives and say something gentle that landed like a slap only I could feel. One Sunday, I came down to find her at my mother's kitchen table, going through a drawer of recipe cards in my mother's handwriting. I asked her as evenly as I could to please leave those alone. She set the cards down, folded her hands, and smiled. "Honey," she said, "you're a guest in this house now." I was standing in the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to roll biscuits. I was 16 years old, and the word guest hit me somewhere I did not have language for yet. I did not argue. I went up to my room and sat very still and understood for the first time that grief was not the worst thing that could happen in a house. Being erased from it slowly and politely was worse. I left the day after I turned 18, not in anger exactly, more like a tenant whose lease has quietly expired. I enrolled in the community college 2 counties over than a paralegal program because the law was the one place I had found where words meant exactly what they said and could not be smiled away. I learned to read a deed. I learned what a fiduciary owes the person who trusts them. I learned that a record, properly made and properly kept, outlives the person who tried to bend it. I built a small, careful life in Cedar Falls, about 40 minutes from the farm. I rented an apartment with a single good chair and worked for a probate attorney named Karen Whitfield, who taught me that most family disasters are not crimes, just paperwork nobody wanted to do. Honestly, my father called on birthdays. The conversations were short. Sharon answered the phone sometimes, and her voice was always warm, which was its own kind of cold. I told myself the farm could wait. I told myself I would deal with it someday. When my father was older, when things were calmer, when I was stronger. That is the lie that over-responsible people tell themselves. We are so busy holding everything together that we forget to hold on to the one thing that was ours. The Hale place was the last thing on earth that still smelled faintly in the back hallway of my mother. And I let 16 years go by telling myself there was time. There was not. My father died 3 months ago on a Tuesday at 68. I learned about it from a voicemail. Sharon had already chosen the funeral home, the casket, the hymns, the plot. She buried him in the town cemetery in Brant, not in the Hale family plot beside my mother. I stood in the back of the church in a black dress I had bought that morning, and a cousin I barely recognized leaned over and asked if I was family or just from work. Sharon spoke about my father for 10 minutes and called him the love of her life. She wore navy and dabbed her eyes at the right moments. Her son Cody sat in the front pew in a suit that fit him better than grief did, scrolling his phone between hymns. Nobody saved me a seat. At the reception in the church basement, Sharon held court near the coffee urn, accepting condolences. And when I came to say goodbye, she took both my hands and squeezed them. "He's at peace now," she told me. The same words strangers had used for my mother. It's time we all moved on. There it was again, 16 years, and the sentence had not changed, only the speaker. I drove the 40 minutes back to Cedar Falls in the dark, and cried the kind of tears that are mostly anger. I was grieving 2 parents at once, the mother I had lost at 16, and the father I had lost, in truth, the day a stranger climbed out of his truck. What I did not know yet was that Sharon was that confident for a reason. She thought she had already won. A month after the funeral, Sharon let me know I could come get a few of Raymond's things. Her generosity had limits, and she enjoyed letting me see them. I drove out on a Saturday. She had set a single cardboard carton on the porch, the way you'd leave a delivery, and stayed inside, watching through the beige curtains. Inside were 3 of my father's flannel shirts, his reading glasses, a coffee mug, and an old canvas barn coat that still smelled of diesel and hay. I carried it all to my car. That night in my apartment, I went through the pockets of the barn coat, more out of habit than hope. In the inside breast pocket, behind a torn seam, my fingers found an envelope. It was soft with age. My name was on the front in my mother's handwriting, the same slanted cursive from the recipe cards. Monica, just that. I sat down on the floor with my back against the good chair and held it for a long time before I opened it. It was dated 3 days before she died. She wrote that she was sorry to leave me so young. She wrote that she had watched me learn to roll biscuits at that kitchen table and that she hoped I would always know where I came from. And then one line I read again and again until the ink blurred. "The land knows you, Monica. You came up out of this ground the same as your grandmother did. Whatever happens, don't let anyone tell you that you are a guest on it." She had known somehow before she died. My mother had known exactly what was coming. And she had pointed me 16 years early toward the one question I had never thought to ask. The question would have stayed buried if Cody hadn't gotten greedy in public. 3 days after I found the letter, the farm showed up online. A real estate listing coming soon with photos. Someone had walked through the Hale place with a wide-angle lens and a staging eye. There was the kitchen where my grandmother taught me biscuits, now bright and empty. There was my mother's front bedroom, where she died, captioned spacious primary suite. There was the back field, my mother's field, photographed by drone at golden hour and labeled 42 acres, endless potential. Cody had shared it on his own page with a row of money emojis, and the caption, "Time to let the old place go." 12 people had liked it. One of them was my Uncle Dale. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the price, a number with a comma in it that made my throat close. And I felt something shift in me that was not grief and not anger, but the cold, clean focus I used at work when a file did not add up. Sharon was selling my mother's family farm. She was doing it loudly, proudly before my father had been in the ground a full season. And the paralegal part of my brain, the part that read deeds for a living, asked a single quiet question that I had spent 16 years too sad and too dutiful to ask. Could she even do that? Whose name was actually on the deed to the Hale place? I did not know. And the not knowing felt suddenly like a door my mother had left open in that letter, waiting for me to finally walk through it. I did not call Sharon. I did not call Cody. 16 years had taught me that talking to them only gave them practice. Instead, I did what I do best. Monday morning before my shift, I sat down with my own laptop and pulled up the Marr County Recorder's online index, the same database I used a dozen times a week for Karen's files. I typed in the Hale Farms parcel number, the one printed right there on the real estate listing for anyone careful enough to read it. The screen loaded a list of recorded documents going back decades, each one a line in the long, quiet history of a piece of ground. Deeds, mortgages paid off, a survey from the 70s. My grandmother's name, my mother's name, and then near the very bottom, a recent entry that did not sit right. A quick claim deed recorded only 8 months ago while my father was still alive. I stared at the date, and the cold focus sharpened into something with edges. I closed the laptop, drove the 40 minutes to the county seat in Brant, and walked into the recorder's office with my paralegal eye and my own grief, and asked the clerk for certified copies of the full chain of title. Because if there was one thing I had learned in 16 years of letting things slide, it was this. A house can be taken from you with a smile, but it can only be kept with a piece of paper. And I was finally, after all this time, going to read the paper. I'm Monica. If you've ever been the quiet one in a family who finally decided to stop being quiet, stay with me. The records office is where this whole story turns. Comment where you're watching from and subscribe. The clerk in Brant was a kind woman with reading glasses on a chain, and she did not rush me. I spread the certified copies across the long oak table in the records room and read them the way I read everything slowly in order. The way you diffuse something. The story the paper told was not the story I had been living. The Hale place had come down through my mother's family for 3 generations. Just like everyone said, my great-grandfather, my grandmother, and then by a deed recorded the year I was born, my mother, Carol Hale. The farm had been my mother's, not my father's, hers. Her name was on the deed, alone. The way separate property looks when a woman inherits land before she ever marries. My father had lived there for 30 years and worked that ground. But the law does not care whose boots are in the field. It cares whose name is on the deed. And when my mother died 16 years ago, I found no deed transferring the farm to my father at all. There was nothing. No will recorded, no conveyance, just my mother's ownership sitting there in the index like a held breath, followed by a gap of 16 years where, legally speaking, nothing clean had ever happened. The clerk noticed my face. "Honey, you all right?" I told her I was fine. I was not fine. I was a paralegal staring at a chain of title with a 16-year link missing, and I knew exactly what a missing link meant. It meant that whatever Sharon thought she owned, the ground under her feet had never stopped belonging, at least in part, to the dead woman whose recipe cards she had gone through at the kitchen table. That night, I did not sleep. I made coffee at 11 and pulled the state probate code up on my laptop. The same statutes I cited in Karen's filings, and I read them as if for the first time, because this time they were about me. My mother had died without a will. Interstate. When a married woman dies into state-owning separate property, our state statute does not simply hand it all to the husband. It splits it. The exact split is different from state to state, and I read ours twice to be sure. Where there is a surviving spouse and one child, each takes a 1/2 undivided share of her separate real property. I read it 3 times. 16 years ago, the spring I turned 16, the day they lowered my mother into the ground, the law had quietly given me an undivided 1/2 an interest in the Hale farm. Half of my mother's land had been mine since I was 16 years old. Nobody had told me. Nobody had probated her estate or partitioned the farm or signed a single honest piece of paper. My father had simply gone on living there. And then a stranger had gone on living there. And the years had piled up over my name like snow over a fence post. But the fence post was still there. I knew enough law to feel the hope and enough law to be afraid of it. Living on land does not erase a co-owner's interest unless you formally push them out in writing. And nobody had ever done that to me. They had just smiled and called me a guest. I closed the laptop at 2 o'clock in the morning and sat in the dark and thought for the first time in 16 years that my mother might have been right. The land did know me. 2 days later, Cody called me. He had not called me in years. His voice was friendly in the rehearsed way of a man reading off a sticky note. He said the sale was moving along nicely, real exciting, and there was just a little paperwork thing the title company wanted cleared up, a formality. He needed me to sign a quit-claim deed. Just to tidy up the file, he said. You know how these title people are. I did know how these title people are. I knew that a quit-claim deed is the document you sign to give away any interest you have in a property. No questions asked, no money required. I knew that a title company had flagged something in their search, which meant a title company had found exactly what I had found in Brant. My name, my half. I kept my voice as warm as Sharon's. I said I'd be glad to look at anything they needed and asked him to email me the document and the title commitment so I could read them first. There was a pause. Then Cody said with an edge sliding in under the friendliness that I didn't need to make it complicated, that it was family, that I should just trust them and come sign. We're not trying to cheat anybody, Monica. I said I never thought they were, and that I still wanted to read at first because I read documents for a living, and it would be strange not to. He hung up without saying goodbye. I sat with the dial tone and understood two things at once. They knew about my half, and they had been hoping I was still the 16-year-old who signed whatever the adults put in front of her. I was not. My Uncle Dale showed up at my apartment on Thursday, which told me how worried they were because Dale did not drive 40 minutes for anything but a funeral or a favor. He is my father's younger brother, a decent enough man in the way of people who think keeping the peace and doing the right thing are the same thing. They are not. He sat in my one good chair with his cap in his hands and told me he'd heard there was some confusion about the farm. He told me Sharon had given my father good years, that I'd been gone a long time, that nobody wanted a fight. Then he said the line they had clearly sent him to deliver. Don't drag your father's name through a courtroom, Monica. Let the woman sell the place and move on. Move on, even Dale. I looked at my uncle and felt the old pull, the one that had cost me 16 years. The pull to be reasonable, to not make trouble, to carry the family's comfort on my own back because I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who could be counted on to absorb the loss so nobody else had to feel it. That instinct is not kindness. I had finally learned the difference. I told Dale I loved him and that I would never say one false word about my father. Then I told him the truth. Uncle Dale, that farm was my mother's. Half of it has been legally mine since I was 16. I'm not dragging anybody's name anywhere. I'm just not signing it away. He left looking troubled, not because he thought I was wrong, but because he could see finally that I was not going to be the one who broke this time. There was one person left who had known my mother as more than a name on a deed, and I had let 16 years go by without calling her. My great-aunt Ruth, my mother's older sister, lived in a tidy little house at the edge of Brant, with a garden that put the hailflower beds to shame. Sharon had eased Ruth out of the family the same way she'd eased me out with warmth and distance, until the invitations simply stopped coming. Ruth opened the door, looked at me and said, "You've got Carol's eyes." Then she put the kettle on. We sat at her table, and I told her everything, the deed, the half, the quitclaim Cody wanted me to sign. Ruth listened the way old women listen without interrupting, turning her teacup in her hands. When I finished, she got up, went to a sideboard, and came back with a framed photograph of two girls on a porch. I recognized the Hale farmhouse porch. "That's me and your mother," she said. Our grandmother homesteaded that ground. It went mother to daughter 4 times. Carol always swore it would go to you. She set the frame down and looked at me hard. When your mother got sick, your father promised her right there in that front bedroom that the farm would be yours someday. I heard him say it. Then 2 weeks after we buried her, that woman moved in and the promises got quiet. Ruth reached across and held my wrist with a grip stronger than it looked. Your mother is in that soil, child. So are you. Don't you let them sell your mother out from under you. I had come looking for a witness. I had found one, but I had also found sitting in Ruth's kitchen the spine I'd been missing since I was 16. I drove back to the recorder's office in Brant the next morning and asked the kind clerk to pull the one document I had skimmed past in my hurry, the recent quitclaim deed recorded 8 months ago while my father was still alive. She brought me a certified copy, and I laid it flat on the oak table and read every line the way I read the ones that matter with a finger under the words. The grantor was Raymond Myers. The grantee was Sharon Vance. The deed transferred the entire Hale farm, all 42 acres, and the house to Sharon alone for the recited sum of $1 and love and affection. But it was not signed by my father's hand. It was signed Raymond Myers by Sharon Vance, his attorney. In fact, Sharon had not asked my father to give her the farm. Sharon had given herself the farm, using a power of attorney, signing his name with her own hand and conveying his property to herself. I knew that signature line. I had typed it 100 times for Karen. An attorney, in fact, is a fiduciary, the highest duty the law knows. Unless the power of attorney says in plain words that the agent may give the principal's property to herself, a transfer like this is presumed void the moment a court looks at it. Self-deing. I checked the date again. 8 months ago. I did the arithmetic in the quiet of that records room and the floor seemed to tilt. 8 months ago. My father had already been in hospice. This was not a man deeding his land to the woman he loved. This was a woman holding his power of attorney while he could no longer understand a sentence, deeding his land to herself and recording it before anyone thought to look. I sat very still and held the certified copy in both hands. It was the most damning piece of paper I had ever read, and it had been sitting in a public index for 8 months, waiting for someone in this family to finally care enough to look it up. A single bad deed is a tragedy. A timeline is a case. I went home and built one the way Karen had taught me, a column of dates down the left side of a legal pad, because juries and judges and even angry relatives believe a timeline in a way they never believe a feeling. I wrote down the date my father entered hospice. I had it from the funeral home paperwork Sharon herself had handed out, proud of how well she'd cared for him. I wrote down the date on the durable power of attorney, which was indexed in the recorder's office too, signed by my father 14 months ago, naming Sharon his attorney. In fact, and I wrote down the date of the self-deing deed. Then I lined them up. The power of attorney had been signed 2 months after my father's dementia diagnosis, which I confirmed against a Medicare summary in the file Sharon had left in that carton, not realizing what she was handing me, the deed to herself, had been signed and recorded 6 weeks after he entered hospice, when the hospice intake notes, which an estate could subpoena, would describe a man who no longer knew the year. The notary who stamped the power of attorney kept a log book by law that anyone could request. I was not guessing anymore. I was assembling. Every date pointed the same direction, and not one of them depended on my word against hers. They were all written down by other people in records that existed whether or not anyone believed me. By the time I capped my pen, I understood what kind of fight this was going to be. Sharon's whole life had been built on what she could make people feel. Mine had been built quietly on what I could prove. And for the first time, that felt less like a weakness and more like a weapon. Sharon must have felt the ground move because she stopped waiting on my signature and tried to outrun me. The listing flipped from coming soon to active with a price cut, the kind sellers make when they want a fast cash buyer and no questions. Cody called twice more, the friendly gone now, telling me the closing was set, that I was holding up the family, that if I didn't sign the quitclaim by Friday, their lawyer would deal with it. Then Sharon herself called the first time in years, her voice doing that warm thing over the phone. She invited me to a little family meeting at the farmhouse Sunday just to talk it through. Just us. No need for lawyers. We could sign everything at the kitchen table like family. The kitchen table where my grandmother taught me biscuits, where Sharon had once gone through my dead mother's recipe cards and called me a guest. I knew exactly what Sunday was. It was the last, softest version of the trap. The one where they'd have the papers ready and the pen out and three of them smiling at me until I gave in just to make it stop. I had walked into that room as a 16-year-old and let myself be erased. I was not walking into it as a 32-year-old to do it again. I told Sharon I'd think about Sunday, which was a lie. And I hung up and called the one person who could turn my legal pad into something Sharon could not smile away. My boss. If you've ever been told to stay quiet for the family's sake, you already know the weight of the choice I was about to make. Stay with me. Subscribe because on Monday morning, I walked into Karen Whitfield's office and put the whole thing on her desk. Karen Whitfield has been practicing probate law for 30 years and has the gift of saying devastating things in a calm voice. I laid it all out on her desk in order, the way she'd trained me. The chain of title showing my mother as sole owner, the intestacy statute, the power of attorney, the self-deeing deed, the timeline. Karen put on her glasses and read for 10 minutes without a word, which from Karen is a standing ovation. When she finished, she took the glasses off and looked at me. "Monica," she said, "this is the cleanest set-aside I've seen in a decade." She walked me through it like I was a client, which I suppose I was now. First, the deed Sharon signed to herself. An attorney, in fact, is a fiduciary, and a fiduciary who transfers the principal's property to herself is self-deeing. Such a transfer is presumptively voidable, Karen said, and good faith does not save it. The question of whether Sharon meant well never even enters the analysis. Second, my interest. When my mother died intestate, I inherited a 1/2 undivided interest in her separate property, and living there for 16 years had never extinguished it, because a co-owner's possession is not adverse to another co-owner without a formal ouster, and nobody had ever ousted me in writing. Sharon could not convey what was never hers. She didn't just overreach, Karen said. She tried to sell a house that is half yours, using a deed she had no power to sign. Third, and this was the part that made me sit up standing, my own half gave me the right to clear the title to my land, and as my father's child, I was an heir of his estate too, an interested person the probate court was bound to hear. After his death, those two things together let me bring all of it before a judge and ask to undo it. Karen folded her hands. So she said, "Do you want to be reasonable, or do you want to be right?" I almost said reasonable. The word was right there, worn smooth from 16 years of use. I thought about Uncle Dale with his cap in his hands. I thought about the church basement and the cousin who asked if I was family. I thought about how much easier my whole life had been when I simply absorbed the loss, so nobody had to fight. Being reasonable had cost me my mother's house. Karen watched me think and did not push, which is why I trust her. Then I thought about the letter in the barn coat 3 days before my mother died in her slanted cursive. "Don't let anyone tell you that you are a guest on it." And I thought about something Karen herself always said to nervous clients. Making a record isn't making a scene. I told her I wanted to file. We did it properly, the way I would want it done if it were anyone else's family falling apart. Karen prepared a petition in the probate court in Brant to set aside the self-deeing deed, to quiet title, confirming my 1/2 interest, and to bring the whole farm back into my father's estate for an honest accounting. And then she did the one thing that would stop Sunday from ever mattering. She recorded a lice pendants against the property, a public notice indexed right there in the recorder's office that the title to the Hale farm was the subject of a lawsuit. No title company on earth would close a sale over a list pendants. The Sunday meeting, the rushed closing, the pen at the kitchen table, all of it died the moment that notice hit the index. I did not call Sharon to tell her. She would find out the way she'd done everything else on paper. The sale collapsed within a week. I know the day had happened because Cody left me a voicemail at 6 o'clock in the morning. No longer friendly, no longer reading off a sticky note. The title company had run their update, found the lease pendants, and walked the buyers straight out the door. There would be no fast cash closing, no money with a comma in it. Not while a court was deciding who actually owned the ground. Cody's message was 40 seconds of words I won't repeat, ending with the promise that this isn't over. He was right about that. It was barely beginning. Sharon called too, and this time the warmth was gone entirely, scraped down to the metal underneath. She told me I was vindictive. She told me my father would be ashamed of me. She told me she had cared for that man when I was nowhere to be found, changed his sheets, sat up with him while I built my little life 40 minutes away, and didn't visit. Some of that was even true, and it landed where she aimed it. But I had learned something in 16 years of reading documents for a living. The truth of how much someone suffered does not give them the right to take what was never theirs. I let her finish. Then I said the only thing I had to say in the calm voice Karen had taught me. Sharon, I'm not stopping you from grieving my father. I'm stopping you from selling my mother. And I hung up. And I did not feel triumphant. Exactly. I felt like a fence post that the snow had finally melted off of, still standing, right where it had always been, right where my mother had set it. Sharon did what people do when the paperwork goes against them. She went to work on the story. By the next week, the whole county had a version of it, and in every version, I was the villain. The cold daughter who'd abandoned her sick father and come crawling back the second there was money on the table. Greedy, ungrateful, dragging a poor widow through court before her husband was cold. Sharon was good at this, better than she'd ever been at honesty. And she had 16 years of casseroles and church socials behind her, while I had a P.O. box in Cedar Falls. Cousins I hadn't spoken to since the funeral suddenly had opinions. Dale stopped returning my calls. For a few bad nights, I almost believed her, because the over-responsible part of me is always half convinced that any conflict is my fault. But Karen reminded me of something useful. A loud story and a true record can both exist, she said. Only one of them is admissible. And there was one moment, just one, when I saw the whole thing differently. I ran into Sharon's pastor at the pharmacy, and he told me gently that Sharon had grown up bouncing between rentals and motel, that she'd never owned a single thing in her life until she married my father, that she was terrified of dying old and homeless. And I understood her then, for exactly one breath. She was not a cartoon. She was a frightened woman who had decided that her fear entitled her to my mother's land. I felt the pity real and complete. And then I let it go, because understanding why someone reaches for your throat is not a reason to let them keep their hand there. Cody found me in town 2 weeks before the hearing. I had driven into Brant to file a document for Karen, an ordinary errand, and he was waiting outside the courthouse like he'd been told my schedule, which he probably had. He was bigger up close than he looked in the listing photos, and angrier. And he planted himself on the sidewalk so I'd have to step around him. He told me I was tearing his mother apart. He told me I'd ruined the sale, ruined her retirement, that she'd given up everything for this family, and I was robbing her. People on the sidewalk slowed to watch, which is what he wanted. The old me, the 16-year-old, would have apologized just to make the staring stop. Instead, I stood there and let him spend himself the way you let a storm pass over a field. When he ran out of words, I said quietly, so he had to lean in to hear it. Cody, I haven't said one untrue thing about anyone. Everything I filed is a public record. If you think I'm wrong, your mother's lawyer can show the judge. Then I stepped around him and walked into the courthouse to file my paper, and my hands were steady on the door. That was the difference between us, and I think he felt it. He had a story and a temper and a sidewalk full of witnesses. I had a stamped, certified, indexed truth that did not care how loudly he stood in my way. He could yell at me until the streetlights came on. The deed would still say what it said. Discovery is the part of the law nobody puts in the movies, and it is where cases are actually won. Karen subpoenaed the records, and one by one they came back and made my timeline into something no story could outshout. The hospice intake notes arrived first. They described my father on the date 6 weeks before Sharon signed the deed to herself as alert to self, only disoriented to time and place, unable to manage personal affairs. A man who did not know the year cannot understand a deed. The neurologist's records came next. The dementia diagnosis, 14 months back. The steady decline charted in a doctor's flat handwriting. Then the notary's journal, which in our state notaries are required to keep, showing the day Sharon brought the power of attorney to be stamped, and a small detail that would matter, that my father had not been present to acknowledge it himself the way the statute prefers. None of it was a secret recording. None of it was my word. It was the ordinary paper that ordinary institutions generate when they do their jobs, sitting in filing cabinets all over the county, waiting to be asked. I sat in Karen's conference room and laid the copies out in date order, and the case stood up on its own like a barn frame when the last beam goes in. Karen looked at it and nodded slowly. She'll fold before the hearing. She said, "People like this always do once they see it's all written down." But Karen was wrong about that, the only time I ever saw her wrong. Sharon did not fold because Sharon had spent her whole life believing that if she just felt strongly enough and spoke warmly enough, the truth would rearrange itself to match her. The hearing was set for the 18th. She walked into it certain she would win. Karen tried to save her, which I did not expect and have come to respect. 3 days before the hearing, she sent Sharon's lawyer a settlement offer that was almost generous. Set aside the deed quietly, no findings, no record of self-deeing. Confirm my 1/2 interest, and let Sharon keep her lawful spousal share of my father's half of the estate. The elective portion the law gives a surviving spouse, no matter what, which was real and not nothing. She would walk away with a roof over her head and her name intact. It was more than she deserved, and exactly what I was willing to give, because I did not want to destroy a frightened old woman. I just wanted my mother's land. Sharon refused. Her lawyer called it insulting. Sharon, I later heard, said she would rather have a judge tell her she owned that farm than take half of it as charity from Carol's daughter. Pride, the pastor had told me, in a woman who'd never owned anything. She could not bear to be handed a portion when she had already convinced herself of the whole. I understood it. I even ached for it a little. But I had made my peace with something on the long drive home from Ruth's kitchen weeks before. I had spent 16 years protecting everyone else's feelings at the cost of my mother's memory. And I was done. If Sharon needed a judge to say the words out loud in front of the family in the county where she'd built her warm and careful story, then a judge would say them. I had offered her the quiet door. She had chosen the public one, so on the morning of the 18th, I put on a gray suit, drove to Brant, and walked into the courtroom to let the record speak. The probate courtroom in Brant is small, paneled in dark wood with 5 rows of benches that creak like a church. They were full. Word travels in a county this size, and a fight over the Hale farm was the best entertainment Morrow County had seen all year. I recognized half the faces. Cousins, neighbors. The pastor sat near the back. Uncle Dale sat in the middle, turning his cap in his hands, unable to meet my eye. And in the front row behind Sharon sat Cody, arms crossed, jaw set, certain. Aunt Ruth came in last, walked the length of the aisle with her chin up, and sat herself directly behind me on my side where everyone could see it. She reached forward and squeezed my shoulder once. Then she let go. Sharon was already at her table in navy, the funeral color, dabbing nothing from dry eyes, leaning toward her lawyer, and whispering with the confidence of a woman who has always eventually gotten her way by being the most certain person in the room. She did not look at me. She looked at the gallery, gauging her audience the way she had at the funeral, the way she had for 16 years at every supper and every social. She thought this was a room she could work. She did not understand yet that a courtroom is the one room in America built specifically so that feelings cannot outvote facts. The judge came in, a tired woman in her 60s who had clearly read the file. We all rose. We all sat. The creak of the benches settled into silence, and Karen stood up with my timeline in her hand and 16 years of my held breath behind it and said, "Your Honor, This matter is about a single deed and who actually had the power to sign it. Karen did not raise her voice once. She never does. She built the thing in front of the judge the same way I'd built it on my legal pad, one dated document at a time, and the quiet of it was its own kind of thunder. She handed up the chain of title and walked the court through 3 generations of Hale women, ending with the deed recorded the year I was born. The farm was Carol Hale's separate property, Your Honor, solely hers. She handed up the intestacy statute and the absence of any will or transfer. When Carol died 16 years ago, her daughter Monica inherited an undivided 1/2 in interest by operation of law. That interest has never been conveyed, never been partitioned, never been extinguished. Then she handed up the power of attorney and the deed, and her voice did not change at all, which made it worse for the other side. 8 months ago, the respondent, acting as attorney, in fact, signed the principal's property over to herself. To herself, Your Honor, for $1. She let that sit. An attorney, in fact, is a fiduciary. A transfer of the principal's property to the fiduciary's own name is self-deeing, and self-deeing is voidable. Good faith is not a defense. It is not an element. And last, she handed up the hospice notes and the neurologist's records and the notary's log in date order, and she read 3 words aloud from the intake, the only words she read in full. Disoriented to time across the room, I watched it land on the gallery. Not on Sharon, who kept her certain face on, but on the people behind her. On the cousins, on Dale, who finally looked up, on Cody, whose crossed arms loosened just slightly, the first crack. They were doing the arithmetic I had done in the records room. A man who did not know the year, and a woman holding his pen, deeding his land to herself, 6 weeks into hospice. The room understood, and I sat very still with my hands folded and said nothing at all. Sharon's lawyer stood and argued that she had cared for my father devotedly, that the farm was rightfully hers after all those years, that I had abandoned the family and come back only for money. It was the story she'd told the whole county, and it had worked everywhere except the one room built to ignore it. The judge listened, then asked a single question. Counsel, can you point me to anything in this power of attorney that authorizes a gift to the agent herself? The lawyer shuffled papers. There was nothing. And that silence is what broke Sharon, because Sharon had never in her life been able to sit quietly while a room turned against her. She came up out of her chair. That is my house. Her voice cracked across the courtroom, and the benches creaked as people leaned back from it. I earned that house. I sat up nights with that man while she flung an arm at me. Was off in her apartment. Too good for us. She was never family. She was always just a guest in that house. A guest. And now she wants to steal it from a widow. The word hung there, the same word she'd said to a 16-year-old at a kitchen table. And it did exactly what I'd spent 16 years afraid it would do. It told the whole room who Sharon really was. The judge let the silence stretch until it was unbearable, then looked at me, and I stood because I would only say this once. I did not raise my voice. I was never a guest in that house. I said it was my mother's. The deed always knew that even when you didn't. Then I sat back down. Sharon stood there with her arms still half raised, and for the first time in 16 years, she had nothing warm left to say. The judge did not need a recess. She had read the file, and now she had seen the woman, and the law made the rest easy. She spoke plainly for the record in the flat, clear voice of someone who has done this 1,000 times and still believes it matters. The power of attorney, she found, gave the agent no authority to make a gift of the principal's property to herself. So the deed Sharon had signed over to her own name was presumptively self-deeing, and nothing in the record came close to rebutting it. The principal's documented incapacity at the time only deepened the presumption. On those findings, the court set the deed aside. The Hale farm was returned to the estate, and on the question of title, the court found that Monica Myers had held an undivided 1/2 interest in the property since the death of her mother, Carol Hale, 16 years prior, and quieted title accordingly. My half was mine. It always had been. A judge had simply said it out loud in a paneled room in front of everyone who had spent 16 years pretending otherwise. I did not cheer. I did not cry. Not there. I just breathed all the way down for what felt like the first time since I was 16. Behind me, Aunt Ruth made a small sound, half laugh, half sob, and pressed her hand flat against my back. Across the aisle, Cody had stopped looking at me and started looking at his mother. And there was something new in his face, something that might have been the beginning of seeing her clearly. The judge gathered her papers and the benches began to creak as the gallery rose and the whole long story of the Hale place. 3 generations and 1 stolen deed and 16 years of my silence came quietly finally to rest on the right side of the truth. It did not end with anyone in handcuffs, and I want to be honest about that because real justice is usually quieter than people hope. The deed was void. The farm came back into the estate, and the law took its ordinary course. My 1/2 was confirmed as mine. My father's half passed through his estate, and from it Sharon received her lawful elective share as his widow, which was real, and which I never tried to take, because the law gives a wife that, and I am not in the business of breaking the law to punish someone for breaking it. She did not end up homeless. She ended up with what was actually hers, which was the thing she had never been able to bear. Cody's row of money emojis came to nothing. Dale called me a week later, sheepish, and said my father would have come around, which we both knew was a kindness rather than a fact. And Sharon, the last time I saw her, was loading boxes into a U-Haul in the gravel drive, an old woman afraid of being old. And I felt the pity again, complete and useless. I did not gloat. I just held the door of my car and let her go. I drove out to the Hale place on the first warm Saturday after it was settled. The 40 minutes from Cedar Falls I knew by heart, and this time there was no sign in the flower bed. I walked the back 40 by myself in the long gold light my mother used to watch from her kitchen window. The biscuits I learned to roll the porch where 2 Hale girls sat for a photograph. The soil 4 generations of women had come up out of. Aunt Ruth came out a few weeks later, and we sat on that porch with iced tea, and she told me stories about my mother I had never heard. The way Carol laughed, the way she could sulk, the whole real person I'd lost too young to know as a person. I am going to keep the farm. I don't know yet whether I'll live there or lease the fields, or just let it sit and breathe. And I am in no hurry to decide. For 16 years, I let other people tell me I was a guest on my mother's land. I am done being told. I am home in the way that matters, which is on paper and in the dirt both. My mother couldn't leave me a perfect will or a tidy explanation, but she left me her name on a piece of ground and 1 line in her own hand, and I finally understand what she meant. The quietest record outlasts the loudest lie, and no one can make you a guest in a place that the truth says is yours. That's my story. 2 weeks after a funeral, 1 stranger at the door, and 16 years until the records finally spoke. If this reminded you to find out whose name is on the deed, or to ask the quiet questions in your own family before it's too late, take that as your sign and do it this week. Share this with someone who needs it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.